So, what if some of the most persistent, most painful social patterns in America didn't actually start where we think they did? Today, we're going to unpack the really controversial thesis from Thomas Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Now, this is a challenging idea, for sure, and it's been debated for years. Let's be clear, our job here is just to lay out the argument exactly as he presents it.
Right off the bat, the book opens with this quote. Sowell is basically signaling his whole game plan from page 1. He's saying, look, we're going to build a historical case based on what he presents as facts, even if those facts make us uncomfortable or challenge the stories we're used to hearing.
So what is this big argument anyway? Well, at its heart, Sowell is taking a sledgehammer to a really common narrative about American history. He's offering a totally different explanation for where certain cultural behaviors came from. So let's look at the two views he puts head to head.
Okay, this is the core of it. On one hand, you have the common view that certain social patterns are a direct result, a legacy of slavery. But Sowell's thesis, it's a radical departure. He argues that these same patterns were actually absorbed from a very specific white Southern culture that was around long before it ever came into contact with enslaved Africans.
Now, Sowell gets it. He admits that the legacy of slavery idea sounds plausible, right? It seems to make sense on the surface. But then he says, hold on a second, because when you really dig into the history, that whole explanation starts to fall apart.
So if the origin isn't slavery, then where on earth does he trace it back to? Well, his argument takes us on a journey, all the way across the Atlantic, to a very particular part of Great Britain.
And the key thing to get here is how specific he is. He's not talking about all of British culture. Nope. He pinpoints the origin to what he calls the Celtic fringe, those historically chaotic, violent border regions of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
So Well then identifies this whole cluster of cultural traits. You've got things like an aversion to steady work, a real neglect of education, and this touchy pride that could just explode into violence at a moment's notice. He argues that back in those lawless borderlands, these traits were maybe even survival skills. But when you transplant that culture to a more stable modern society, those same traits become incredibly destructive.
And this quote right here is a perfect example of that touchy pride he's talking about. It's that idea of being disrespected or dissed and responding with this overwhelming life-or-death violence. Sowell claims this was a central feature of this culture.
Okay, so you might be wondering, how does a culture like this travel all the way from the British borderlands to modern American cities? Well, Sowell lays out a very clear path, like a chain of transmission. He argues it was this four-step journey. First, it starts with white immigrants who settle the American South. Then, over generations, it gets absorbed by the Southern blacks living right there alongside them. And finally, during the Great Migration, it's carried north into urban centers. It's really a theory of cultural contagion, spreading across time and space.
And here's where it gets wild. Sowell says the evidence isn't just behavioral. You can hear it in the language. He makes this pretty startling claim that a lot of what we call Black English, like saying ax instead of ask, isn't from Africa at all. He says it's actually an old speech pattern from those specific regions of Britain, basically preserved like a fossil in modern language.
And that brings us to that really provocative term from the title. When Sowell says black rednecks, he's not just using a slur. It's his specific technical term for this idea. The thesis that this white Southern redneck culture was absorbed by and then preserved within a part of the black population.
Now, to back up this idea that this was a real, distinct, and pretty counterproductive culture among whites in the South, Sowell points to data like this from before the Civil War. I mean, look at that illiteracy rate, over 20% in the white South compared to less than 1% in New England. He uses this to argue that there was already this massive cultural gap in attitudes towards things like education and work.
All right, so that's the historical part of the argument. But then, the thesis takes this massive leap right into the modern era. Sowell asks a really important question. If this culture is so old and so damaging, why does it still exist? And this is where his argument takes its second and maybe even more controversial turn.
70%. This number is huge. That's the percentage of black children born to unmarried women in 1994. What's absolutely stunning, though, is that back in 1960, that number was only 22%. Sowell looks at that dramatic change in just one generation and says, something happened here, and we need to explain it.
For Sowell, the timing is everything. He says this massive shift didn't happen right after slavery. It happened a whole century later. And he argues it lines up almost perfectly with the huge expansion of the welfare state in the 1960s, which, in his view, made the single-parent family economically possible on a mass scale for the very first time.
And this is where the second part of the title comes in: white liberals. Sowell's argument here is that modern liberal ideology, by focusing only on external things like racism and poverty, has effectively provided alibis and shut down any talk about internal cultural patterns that might be causing problems.
So, he says this older culture is basically kept on life support by a three-part mechanism. First, the welfare state makes self-destructive lifestyles economically survivable. Second, he claims that intellectuals and academics praise these same patterns as some kind of authentic racial identity. And finally, if anyone tries to critique these cultural patterns, they're immediately shut down with the charge of blaming the victim, which makes any real conversation impossible.
So, given how incendiary all of this is, you gotta ask, what's the point? Why make such a challenging, and to many, offensive argument? What's the goal?
Well, in the book's preface, Sowell is really clear about this. He says he's not here to offer a 5-point plan or a political solution. His stated goal is just to add a different historical understanding to force us to re-examine the stories we tell ourselves by looking at history from a completely different angle.
He pulls out this quote from the philosopher Eric Hoffer to make a much bigger point about just human nature. The idea is that an alibi, an external reason for why we're struggling, can feel a lot better, a lot more comforting than the tough, messy work of actual achievement.
And this is really the bottom line of the whole argument. From his point of view, focusing on external blame and offering what he calls alibis, no matter how good the intentions are, is ultimately a disservice. He argues the only thing that brings real respect, including self-respect, is achievement. And that means you have to confront any internal cultural roadblocks that are standing in the way.
And so, whether you completely agree with this thesis or you completely reject it, it leaves us with this really powerful question. It forces us to think about how the stories we tell about the past, the historical narratives we choose to believe, profoundly shape how we see the problems of today and what we think we can or can't do about them.